Let's see. It's not live streaming. It seems like it is, but it's technically not from all that I can gather. So you see what we're doing. I'm trying to live stream on YouTube, but it's like, I think it records it and then I get a link to it and then I can share it. So it's a live stream, but not really. Tried it earlier. I couldn't find the link, so we'll see what happens. Just trying something new. Always gotta, right? Okay. All right, let's see. Let's go back to our Moodle. I think I'm slowed down with my internet because of the streaming. That's okay. We'll just deal with it. Okay, so I've updated your week 13 this week to incorporate the reading for the week. Basically, it's just one article, okay? It's just an article that I wrote in 2014 talking about the specifics of the Awastingni case, how it was done, all the details about it. So just to update you a little bit about this week, we'll get started talking about development, self-determination, human rights, and those kinds of topics. And then on Wednesday, we'll get into talking more specifically about the case of Awastingni. I'll show you maps. I'll talk about methods. We'll get more into the details of exactly how we did it and what we did and the procedures that we used. Okay? All right. So in preparation for that, you'll want to take a look at this reading from 2014 called The Mayagna Resolved to Save Their Rainforest, Their Homelands. Okay. All right. So just to kind of review as to where we've come, I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. Did everybody have a good Thanksgiving? Yeah. Did you all go home? Did you have turkey? Did you have vegetables? All those good things? Yeah. Anything special you ate that was fun that you missed that you hadn't in a long time? Or people you'd seen or things you did? Anybody? Nobody had any fun? Really? No? All right, well, fine. I had fun. Okay, so talking about where we've been and where we're going, we've been talking about legal anthropology, right? We talked about the UN DRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, passed in 2007, right? And we also talked about our country's use of blood quantum as a proxy for indigeneity. So for defining who indigenous people are, we tend to use blood quantum, 25% being the typical, right? So if you don't have 25%, you have under that, you're dropped from your indigenous rights, you're not a tribal member, and you won't be receiving a tribal check. And we talked about this as a method of genocide, right? Or ethnocide, in terms of eventually weeding out the indigenous populations and making it so that they don't have any special rights because there aren't any more, right? By law. So talked about blood quantum, talked a little bit about other countries, right? About how they measure indigeneity, right? Such as Nicaragua, where your tribal group will recognize your membership and therefore the nation state is recognizing your membership, okay? So we have a wide range of what various countries are doing in terms of recognizing indigenous. Then we went on to talk about whaling, right? We talked about two cases. We talked about the case of the macaw with gray whales in Washington State, right? And we talked about the case of the umulet as they whale after the bowhead in the northern Alaska, Barrow, Alaska kind of area, okay? We also talked about what modern technology has to do with that discussion. Remember, we said some are arguing traditional rights should only use traditional methods, right? We talked about the harpoon gun as being more modern methods and actually something that helps the whale die faster and therefore suffer less. And yet we still have this focus on, if you're going to assert traditional rights, you should do it traditionally, right? Same thing when we talked about the Sama and their herding of caribou and use of the snowmobile and even helicopters, right? So we've got this idea about what indigenous rights should look like. They should be traditional. They should reinforce your traditional culture. We don't have a tendency to accept, as we talked about also, the evolving aspect of cultures, right? Like the use of modern technology and the like. We have a tendency to want to view them as in some kind of a living museum, right? Okay. So that's our approach from the outside. We also talked about our historical approaches to indigenous people. We'll get into that more as we talk today. Okay. All right. So today we're going to talk about cultural change, globalization, and development. To begin specifically talking about development, I want to remind you of applied anthropology. Okay, I didn't put the applied anthropology reading yet up on Moodle. I will, so you can get to that. It's only a couple of pages, but essentially we're talking about taking a look at the old theories of anthropology that we took a look at in the beginning of the semester. If you remember, we looked at a few aspects. We said, you know, there's this thing called interpretive anthropology, right? Which means that everything that we think of or talk about in anthropology ultimately is an interpretation, right? Something that we're making as a formulation of an idea through our own cultural lenses and the like. Yeah? Then we have the discussions that we had with the area of postmodernism, right? And some of the comments that people have made over the years saying, you know, geez, anthropology really is just a representation of anthropology. It's just a demonstration of the westernized concept of how we think we need to be studying other cultures, right? So in other words, we're just doing anthropology. Our interpretations are coming from our own culture. So what are we even thinking about in terms of applied anthropology? Can we do it, right? So the question is pretty valid, because if we're talking about judgments based on interpretations and being dominatory in a Western sense, right, applying those ideas to helping another culture seems a bit hegemonic or dominatory, right, when we're talking about it. So this is kind of the starting point where we came from in talking about development. So we also talked about colonialism, imperialism, and the world systems theory. Remember, we said that especially the last 700 years of colonialism, we've seen really a full-fledged development of our current economic global system, right? Broken into world systems where we have a first world, second world, third world, never mind the fourth world, we know what that is, right? Indigenous nations housed within other nations, although preferably we'd like to say first world nations, right? Yeah. So we've got first world, second world, third world that came about from our history. We then have these entities that have been created to deal with them. We have the World Bank, we have the IMF, we have countless number of international agencies, foreign aid agencies, even from countries, right, developed just to help equalize this disequilibrium that we created in colonialism, right? We talked about Awastingni being titled as an indigenous lands because of the fact that Nicaragua is a third world country, and because of the fact that they rely on 60% of all their spending to come from the World Bank, right? We use the World Bank pretty much to manipulate the sovereignty and coerce the sovereignty of Nicaragua into doing what we wanted. Thank goodness the World Bank agreed, right? I guess that's what we want, maybe we want to say. Okay, so in terms of development, we have used various methods to manipulate countries, especially those that are in the third or even second world. And we can do this because of all the debt, right? Because of that structure. Okay, so we think that we need to continue doing this. We talk about the poor, we talk about how important it is to have the poor no longer be poor, right? Working in the development community for the last 25 years, I can tell you we've got various feelings about this. One day I went into CARE International. How many people know about CARE International? Have you ever heard of it? Yeah, great. Okay, they used to be tied directly with Starbucks. So like every dollar that you spent on coffee, they donate a certain amount to CARE International and whatnot. Meeting with their board of directors, you might find it surprising that when you ask them about their projects, they say the reason why we're doing these projects is to raise the level of poverty among a group of people so that they can then engage in the rest of the world economy, so that they can engage with the first world, right? Sounds kind of selfish on our part to do development work so that we can get more people to engage with us economically. So if we maybe broaden that a little bit further and we say, well, not only engage in the first world, but maybe have the opportunities that the rest of us have in the first world, right? Okay, you can broaden that if you want to make yourself feel better about development, right? Now, typically, and maybe even still today, oftentimes development really comes from other places. It doesn't come from those countries. To give you an example, organizations like the World Bank or the United Nations or USAID, they'll give you a laundry list of all the things that your projects have to include. Now, some of these are good, like 50% of the participants have to be women. Yay, right? But they also might say other kinds of things, like if you're going to put together a project in agriculture, you have to use these kinds of seeds. Or if you're going to do some kind of a project in economic development, you're going to have to work in this kind of an area. So still to this very day, we partition funds based on what we think we ought to spend in those third world countries, based on how we think they should develop. Not just us as a country, but us as a world, right? We even come together as United Nations in some terms to decide what's important to us, like the Millennium Goals, right? And then everything that falls out for those funds have to adhere to those standards. So in this sense, we're still very much crafting development around the world. Pretty much in a hegemonic way, if you want to look at it, right? Determining for other people. But that's not exactly what we said we wanted, right? When we talked about Indigenous people, we talked about self-determination. Remember that? And how important it is for them to be able to decide for themselves about their future, especially because it's culture. This is their culture, and it's something real specific that's going to determine something real specific about their future, right? So, in terms of development, we might look back to history. We might look to the 60s and 70s when a number of perspectives started to change. In Latin America, we had a lot of different kinds of movements going on. We had independence movements. We had movements to reform the land ownerships, right? We had movements to redistribute wealth. All kinds of things started to change. And in that process, we discovered we had a lot of people in the third world status that needed help. Quite frankly, by example, adult literacy, right? Imagine what it would be like to have large swaths of our US population, adults like your age, my age, not able to read or write. Different kind of education, right? Because it's not about kids. It's not about how we feel about A is for apple and D is for dog. I mean, these kinds of things can, at our age, get a little bit insulting, right? So we have to design a completely different kind of education that's respectful of others, right? That doesn't put others down. And then in the development world, we took that also into how to interact with others in a social kind of affair, right? Now, our example we have was from Paulo Freire, Brazilian sociologist, wrote a book that was pretty notable called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Pedagogy meaning how we learn, how we teach each other, and something a little bit different than your typical education. Education has this traditional education. We have a couple of ways of teaching. Rote memory is one. How many people know about rote memory? What is rote education? Do you know what I'm talking about? It's where we make you memorize stuff. We say, here's all the stuff that you need to learn, all the, kingdoms of the horse and all its related species. Go ahead and memorize it. We'll give you a test and you can spit it out, right? That's your rote memory kind of education. But then there's analytical thinking. We talk about wanting to promote analytical thinking for people, right? Oftentimes, education used to be about telling you what to think, right? Hey, we revolve around a sun, not the earth, right? But in these terms, we're talking about not telling you what to think. We're talking about a different kind of education. We're talking about an education where I'm not banking my information in you, right? It's not me up here, the authoritarian, telling you what to think, telling you how to think, right? The idea more is that we're acting like a facilitator, really. That the two of us working together, student, teacher, almost like facilitator role, right? Where we help each other, where we work together, where we teach each other. To say that you only learn from me would be a ridiculous, absurd statement, even in this classroom. I learn from you every day, right? Be it through your assignments, through your comments, through your reactions to what I have to say, conversation, your opinions, right? It's an interaction. It's not just a one-way street. So this is what we thought about when we took these ideas into development. We said, this is how we got to act in development. We can't just come down like what's so common. I tell you, in 1998, we had a hurricane in Nicaragua, and it was horrible. It was horrible. The people that I work with way up in the mountains lost a lot, right? We've talked about this. I think maybe I've even mentioned it. They lost 100% of their crops, 98% of their animals. They lost their clothes. Even their water in their rivers were muddy and they couldn't drink it. People were going in to bathe in the rivers that were muddy that they couldn't see in. And because of all of the rains and all of the upset, people were even getting blown up by mines that had not been found from the war. I mean, it was awful, horrific experience, right? USAID, US government decided, got to get down there. Like a lot of other governments, got to get down there, got to help out. This is horrific. We got to be there, just like with other countries, Puerto Rico or other places, right? We send our crew. I showed up the day after the hurricane hit, see what we could do, and rode up to go see the communities in a helicopter along with the USAID team. They had just been flown in from Washington, D.C. They went around with me as well to do reconnaissance and to discover what was wrong. Then about a week, 2 weeks later, they came up with their plan, their recommendation of what to do. It hit the ground. They started off with relief work, and that was that. This is how we commonly do a lot of development work. We bring in people from the north to tell the south what to do, as if others in the third world are too stupid to know what to do, as if others in the third world are too stupid not to be in the third world. But we know this is wrong, right? We know, historically speaking, that the third world and how that all came to be was not about stupidity. We got history, politics, geography, and a lot on how that all developed. So to assume that they're in poverty because they're stupid is just absurd, right? But that's what we do when we bring our contractors down to tell people what to do. So then we have to deal with other areas that might be difficult to deal with. For example, human rights, right? Talking about what is a human right in relation to culture. We'll get into that in just a minute, okay? In development, we started development in the 60s and 70s with this kind of traditional way of doing things. Oh, well, we'll help you with education, with medical care, with this and that and this and that, right? You can look at the World Bank, the World Resource Institute for statistics on problems. And we approach this with the idea of we need to solve problems. They've got a lot of problems. We need to solve problems. And then we took on this new buzz term called sustainable development. Right. So when you think of the word development, how many people think of that in terms of negativity? Development is negative. Raise your hands. Okay. How about development is positive? Raise your hands. Wow. Okay. So the majority have positive feelings. We got maybe a little bit that say negative, right? Okay. So this idea about development being positive versus negative might be in comparison to, well, the negative might be, oh, we have a new development over here, 150 new homes. They're going to put pressure on the roads. We're going to have to reform all of our traffic ways and all that kind of stuff, right? That's one form of development, right? Another form of development might be, well, we got a new university, we got a new library, we got a new internet system that's all faster and great, right? Okay, so that's another kind of development that maybe we might think of as being positive, right? In terms of development and our history of development, we've tended to come and counsel those in poverty with what they need to do. Then we shifted to this concept called sustainable development. And some people said, that's a really weird way to combine those two words because they're an oxymoron, right? Development means some pretty interesting things. And then when you think about sustainability, what does that mean? What does sustainability mean? Maintain for a long time. Okay. How long? Difficult measure, right? It's like, long time. Well, I'm not sure how long is a long time, right? One of the things that we say is we don't want to subtract from the future generations, right? So whatever we do, let's make sure we don't subtract from the future generations, like those yet to be born. Others say we want something that's going to last at least 7 generations. That's kind of an indigenous concept, but that's one that has been reaching some of our circles now too, right? Some say it's an oxymoron because development in the negative sense, along with sustainability, that just doesn't make sense at all, right? But then others took it a little bit further and they said, in order for something to be sustainable, it needs to be something that people want. It needs to be something that maybe people drive themselves, right? What an interesting concept, not brought in from the outside. We bring in something from the outside, it usually falls apart after a year, a couple years, something like that, right? An example might be we can put in a brand new rice milling unit, right? We did this once. We put in a brand new rice milling unit for one community on an island called Ometepe. Within a couple of years, it broke. That's not sustainable. Not if they don't have the ability to fix it. Not if they don't have the knowledge of how to fix it. It's not sustainable at all. In fact, it just became a big hunk of junk, right? So what we really want is something that's going to last. What we really want is something that's going to help people, right? So that's a different kind of direction. Now, let's briefly go back to the UN DRIP for a moment and remind ourselves that when we talked about the UN DRIP, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, it was with the idea that we're supporting their human rights, right? One was the demilitarization of their lands. This makes perfect sense, right? One of the big pieces was self-determination. We want to make sure that they get to be the ones in charge. They get to be the ones that determine their futures, especially on their own terms, right? Widely, though, these days, we tend to focus on free, prior, informed consent. Remember, we talked about this, free, prior, informed consent. This is where we say, hey, in order for anything to happen with Indigenous people, they must be informed in a free way prior, and they must consent, right? Never mind how we measure all that, right? But we wanted that to be a part of the key factor of the UN DRIP. Still, though, looking at it, it's still not there when we're talking about self-determination. Tell me this, have you ever signed a consent paper? Did you write it? Didn't write it, did you? Somebody else brought it to you, didn't they? Right? So this is about consent on other things that people are doing that are affecting Indigenous people. We said that the UN DRIP whittled all the way down to free, prior, informed consent, and yet technically that is just a way to ensure that they get a say in what's happening. That isn't self-determination, right? So we're still far from the mark, okay? Now, one of our problems that we have here is how to support human rights. Are human rights universal? Yeah, kind of. Maybe we could say that they're universal, but specific human rights, not so much, right? We talked about ethnocentrism. Remember that? We said, don't be ethnocentric, right? Really bad for us to be ethnocentric. Don't want to go there. Racism, don't like that. And then we introduced to you the, almost as if it was a polar, the cultural relative side. We said, hey, cultural relativism is about like walking a mile in the other's shoes, right? Or taking a look at the culture from their perspective. And we said, this is important for us to do, right? And we talked about an issue in relation to that, and that was female circumcision, or female cutting, or female genital mutilation, whatever have you, right? And we said, this is one of our biggest issues to try and deal with, right? WHO, World Health Organization, says this is a violation of the human rights of girls. We have people from that culture that say, no, we want to maintain this practice. This is a cultural practice. It's important for us. And some criticism by human rights workers saying, how can they even say they're only 12? They don't know what they want. Oh, well, it was the adults that said that. Oh, they're holding the children hostage, right? No, maybe there's something else going on here. Whatever the case may be, that one little problem tells us that if we say human rights is about this, it can't be 100% universal, right? Because if you look at the rights of the child says children are guaranteed the ability to not have violence. WHO is right. Under international human rights law, female circumcision is against that. Saying that international human rights law is universal, applicable to all, and culturally relative is just not the case, right? We know there are some specific decisions that have been made that aren't consistent with all cultures, right? So, while we rest our human rights on morals, they are specific morals, and we don't quite have international consensus on 100% level, yeah, on all topics. So, trying to respect that level of culture, yet also respect their human rights, we've got a different kind of an approach to things like land rights or even development. Okay, so let's talk about different kinds of development. Most common is what we do when we do development from the outside. Okay, you can get trained in this. You can get trained in this here, right? How many people have heard of needs assessments? Yeah. Okay, different kinds of studies, needs assessments, rapid appraisals. Those are other examples of what we do. So on this kind of an activity, we come in as outsiders, consultants. We do a needs appraisal. We look at all the problems. If you're our community in need, we look at what's wrong with you. How many of you don't have the proper education? How many of you are sick? How many of you are at a low income level? How many of you haven't been to college? How many of you don't speak more than one language? And then we tell you what your problems are. And we say, here's your problems. and here's how we're going to fix them. And we'll come back later and we'll evaluate if we did a good job, right? In that scenario, we have people that we work with that are clients or beneficiaries. That's what we call them. They're called clients, right? When we're done, we get to leave, right? Even after the assessment of the hurricane, gentleman flew back to Washington, D.C., right? Done with my consultation. Get to go home, right? No longer are we needed in sweating it out in an area that has little food, in a place where you might get little sleep, in a place that might be really rough. No, you get to go home. You get to have your steak dinner with your glass of wine and your dessert and have a nice big bath or whatever have you, right? So we say that development can threaten the well-being of people. This is the kind of development that can do that. An example of what we did with native tribes here, development. We're going to take them and put them all on a piece of land. We're going to give them a store where they can buy their food. Only we didn't talk about stocking the food with, or stocking the stores with really bad food, eventually giving them heart problems and other kinds of diabetes problems and the like, right? So it can threaten their well-being. It can threaten everything from traditional diets, traditional ways of doing things, traditional structures of leadership, right? Now let's take a look at a different approach. This is a really difficult approach to fund because it's called participatory. We start off with what's called participatory planning, which means that when we go to a funder, we have no idea what we're going to do. Imagine trying to go to somebody and say, I want to do something. We're ready to go. We have no idea what we're going to do, but it's going to be great, right? Not much funding for participatory funding or participatory processes of deciding what to do, right? So this is one of the reasons why it's not as common. In participatory planning, we're talking about having everybody there. When we worked with Awastingnia, what we did is we worked in a couple of questions into their surveys as to what is important to you. And instantly we had a list of the top 10 things that were important to them. All of a sudden we had a talking point. We had things we could talk about. Well, what is interesting to you about getting a road? What is interesting to you about getting that last title to all of your lands, right? And we can take it from there and put things on the ground. Myself as a facilitator, I can hook them up to organizations that have funding or projects like this. Just as myself as a facilitator could hook you up as students to potential projects that you might be interested in working on, right? Same kind of role. Participatory planning. So we then move on and talk about strengths and capacities. Remember our first way of doing things? We talked about all the problems, all the needs you have. Oh, so many needs. Here, we have a different approach. We come into Awastingnia and we say, we want to know who here is studying forestry, who here knows anything about mapping, who here knows how to handle a GPS unit, or even GIS. Who here knows about social study, science? Who here is interested in these kinds of things? And pretty soon we get a list of a whole bunch of people that have a whole bunch of capacities, assets, things to build on, things to support, right? Leaders. And soon as we go down the road with whatever kind of project it might be land title, be some kind of a museum for preserving indigenous knowledge or whatever have you, it's obvious that the people there are the ones that drive it, run it, own it, and envision it. This is different than our little rice milling thing that broke when nobody could figure out how to fix it, right? In terms of sustainability, obviously it's going to be sustainable. It's their project, it's their interest, it's their goals, it's their drive, it's their future, right? Change is being driven from the inside, not the outside, but from the inside. And because of that, the community members can adapt to it on their own terms. Think about how many situations around the world we have right now where we are trying to resolve them with international pressure. Think about all the number of conflicts of international pressure that we put on that have maintained these problems, right? Some on the ground just begging to have the opportunity to resolve the problems themselves without the pressure of the outside. Even the Middle East, looking at Israel. So many people, even in Israel, Arab, Jews, all sides, asking for the opportunity to be the ones in control of what's happening rather than the UN, right? We got 9 new resolutions against Israel just last week. Yay. 0 against Syria. Do you know that? Should we have 0 against Syria? Do you know what happened this last week while we were all enjoying our Thanksgiving turkeys? Didn't know, huh? Chloride gas dropped on people for yet maybe another time. We've gone on for what, 10, 15, almost 15 years now with the Syria issue? Just last week, right when we were having those decisions at the UN, and they get dumped by gaseous poison. And yet nobody wants to stand up in the UN and say that was wrong. So, in terms of changing things from the inside, we don't have a lot of tradition for that. We don't have a lot of money for that. But technically, when we're talking about self-determination, this is more what we're talking about. And while it might seem scary to support the unbridled ownership of land, right? Remember we talked about indigenous land. In order to get indigenous land today, you got to prove how you're going to use it, right? If it was really self-determined, we wouldn't do that. It wouldn't be about proving how you're going to conserve what we're caring about. It would be unbridled, meaning they get to choose. We can say, don't follow our example, right? Our country only puts 4% of all of our lands aside in the lower 48 for something called conservation, right? As opposed to the Mayagda that maybe put aside 80%, right? Or even Israel, they put aside 21%, okay? So, when we're talking about resolving that question about how to support indigenous people in their human rights, one of the biggest perspectives that has shown the most promise in terms of really self-determination and supporting their right has been development from the inside and encouraging their capacities and strengths to flourish. All right, that's all I have to say today. On Wednesday, we'll come back and we'll talk about the Awastingni case, yeah? And get into the details about how we took this on the ground and really encourage that participatory process of land rights. Okay? How to turn off. Oh, end stream.